Welcome back. The breaking news tonight, a former top Trump campaign official indicted by the special counsel is ready to strike a deal. A report from the Los Angeles Times says Rick Gates will plead guilty to fraud charges in the next few days in exchange for testimony against his former boss, ex-Trump campaign CEO Paul Manafort. And joining us now, former CIA director and former advisor to the Trump campaign, James Woolsey. Sir, Rick Gates pleading guilty. What implications do you think this has for the special counsel probe into Russian meddling?
Well, the politics of all this are really interesting. It looks like the man who jumped on the horse and rode off in all directions at once, as Mark Twain once said. But it's not the main point. The main point is not to have to let the Russians get all over our electoral system and run it until we indict one or two people for one thing or another. We've got to stop what they are doing, and that takes a different approach than just indicting and convicting people who have screwed up in some way.
Well, I guess number one, you have to admit that this happened. And National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster said the evidence Russian launched an influence campaign in 2016 was incontrovertible. The president tweeted chastising his National Security Advisor for making that comment. And here's the tweet from the president today. General McMaster forgot to say that the results of the 2016 election were not impacted or changed by the Russians, and that the only collusion was between Russia and Crooked H, the DNC, and the Dems. Remember the dirty dossier, uranium, speeches, emails, and the Podesta company. Why do you think the president is going after McMaster for acknowledging the obvious when it comes to Russia's election meddling?
I don't know. That seems pretty straightforward what McMaster said. But the key thing is to stop this from happening. And I think one thing we want to do is to try to see if we can get the price of oil down 10 or 20 dollars a barrel, down into the 30s or at least into the 40s, so that Russia, for the main thing it sells overseas, is oil and gas, that Russia is put in a real tight bind economically. Sure. I was negotiating with the Russians back in 79 or 89, 90, 91, and when the Berlin Wall went down. And I tell you, you've never seen such friendly Russians, accommodating Russians. Once they saw the key part of their infrastructure, their sort of political infrastructure falling apart, they got to be relatively easy to deal with. And I think that's what we ought to do to them, is undermine their ability to make what money they do now from oil and gas.
Well, people are saying, why aren't you implementing the sanctions that Congress passed almost unanimously? And even since this indictment came down on Friday, President Trump has tweeted at least 13 times about it, but he hasn't even once condemned Russia.
The sanctions would be useful, but they're tiny compared to being able to get down into the 30s or 40s with the price of oil, let's say.
Should the president condemn Russia? Should the president say this is not okay? Should the president acknowledge that Russia attacked our democratic election system?
It doesn't matter what he says. What matters is what he does. And if
what is he doing?
If he can undermine their power, which it depends very heavily on a high price for oil. If he can undermine that, he doesn't have to talk. He doesn't have to say a darn thing about what he's succeeded in doing or not succeeded in doing. Reagan and Casey did something that very, very badly messed up the natural gas system of the then Soviet Union, and they didn't say a word about it. The Russians sure knew what we were doing, and they were devastated.
What are you seeing this administration do in order to prevent Russia from meddling in the upcoming 2018 election or even beyond? Because we heard the current CIA director, Pompeo, say it's happening.
This is not a board game. We don't have to respond in the same way that they come after us. They can come after us with cyber. Doesn't mean we go back at them on cyber. We can do something else if it's more effective. And what would be more effective is letting people switch fuels in their cars so they can drive on whatever is available when they pull up to a filling station. That would drive the price of petroleum products down, and that would be hundreds of times more devastating to the Russians than having to put up with a few of these relatively minor sanctions.
I hear what you're saying in terms of what you believe should be done, but I think my question is, what is this administration currently doing to have an impact to thwart additional Russian attacks? Because it's laid out in detail in this 37-page indictment what they were doing in order to successfully manipulate Americans who were planning to vote in the election.
Absolutely, but although we need to try to get them to stop that, we don't need to rely on replying with steps that are analogous to what they are doing. We can do something much more effective. We don't need to mimic them.
Yes. No, I get what you're saying, but is that being done? Are the steps that are necessary being taken?
No, it's not. Not close.
Okay, let me have you listen to what Deputy AG Rod Rosenstein said on Friday when he announced the indictment.
Okay.
Now, there is no allegation in this indictment that any American was a knowing participant in this illegal activity.
Short and sweet. President Trump says that proves there's no collusion between Russia and the Trump camp. The Deputy Attorney General, though, says there's no allegation of that in this indictment. Aren't those critical words there, in this indictment?
Sure. This is an important issue. We need to get it right, but it's not going to have a big effect on what the Russians are doing. Look, the Russians have been doing this, interfering with elections and the like, going back into the 20s and 30s. What's new is not their interference with our institutions, including elections. What's new is they're being able to do it with computers. So the whole business of the cyber attack is relatively new, and that has made it difficult for us to defend against some of the things they're doing. But we should not play the same game they're playing. We can be much more effective than them.
If you were running a counterintelligence investigation, would President Trump refusing to acknowledge Russia meddled in the election make you suspicious?
Well, maybe, probably not necessarily. It's an investigation. There are two kinds of investigations that can be done under FARA. One basically looking at a crime, and another looking at counterintelligence, which is really just a matter of collecting information. So a counterintelligence investigation doesn't necessarily produce a criminal violation, and the collusion is not a word that's used in the statute. There's no bar, statutory or otherwise, as far as I know, against colluding. What there is a bar against conspiracies, and that would, of course, be a serious matter. But that hasn't been claimed here, as far as I know.
Can you think of any reason why the president wouldn't use the words that his national security advisor used and put a point and an exclamation point on it? Yes, Russia did this?
Again, I don't care what words he uses, I care what he does. And if by letting all sorts of different vehicles drive on whatever they want, on one of two fuels, let's say electricity or ethanol, if they can switch fuels when they come up to the filling station, they can drive the price of oil down. If they drive the price of oil down, it makes so much more difference than the way in which we indict someone for conspiracy to work with the Russians. That has to get done right. It's important, but it's nowhere near what would happen if Russia had to face $30, $40 a barrel oil consistently. They would be about as unhappy as countries get.
James Woolsey, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
Coming up, the community of